Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone, and thank you to the crew. I'd like to start with the question, and a wide open question. Of course, everything is open to interpretation, and the concept of ethics was, is, and will always be as open as ever. But I believe what we understand of ethics is different to what people understand of ethics. And by people, I like to get your thoughts specifically on the new generations. What I believe to be a very interesting generation, indeed, the generation that was born with the internet, lived their social lives on social media. Then came climate crisis, and of course, a pandemic. It's a very interesting generation indeed. A generation that inevitably, one way or another, is entangled with technology, whether they are consumers or they will participate in creating technology. And a technology that I believe in digital products, and specifically in the world of retail, has one thing in common. And what I believe it has in common is that it tends to objectify the consumer, tends to see the subject as an object of use that can be known, that can be uncovered, predicted as a simple, lifeless thing, right? But of course, this is very dear to us, but what does this new generation think of this? Is that something relevant to them? They see it. They look at this documentary, Netflix, Social Dilemma, with a friendly concern, but does it go beyond that? And I'd like to start with your thoughts there, Giles.
Yes, it is an interesting question. Personally, I'm not sure that the generational effect is uniform. That's definitely not my experience. I think that these are concerns that we'll find in every age group, and also paradoxical behaviour in every age group. You know, in terms of not only across the age group, but even in terms of individuals within the age group of saying they're concerned about giving data, and yet quite merrily using tools which, if they stopped and thought about it, you know, are obviously collecting data upon them. So, yeah, for me, I guess I see the generational thing as less of a driving force, and maybe more people's outlooks and their circumstances and their experiences being what drives people's opinions on these things.
Very good. Who wants to follow on that?
No, I was just going to say, I think it often comes down to the age-old question of a value exchange, of I want to use a product or a service, and as a result, there's some sort of give and take in there. I think for me, the challenge becomes, and is becoming stronger, is individuals having sufficient visibility and transparency around what that value exchange looks like. So I think certainly I find my teenage children, they understand what they're getting. Mm-hmm. How well they understand what they're giving and where that's going and what's being done with it, I think isn't as clear. And so I think sometimes that ease with which they engage with those products and services, maybe because they don't have the transparency and visibility that they ought to. They may not want it yet, but they may not know.
I agree with Giles to an extent. I think I don't think you can split it by age. However, uniformity and conformity, when you look at how the younger generation conform, is based around their acceptance in digital space through the number of likes, follows, etc. And that's what they deem as popularity. And so they're conforming to a system they're not actually in control of as such. And I think that's very different. That's very different in the society that I grew up in, Yeah, we conformed in much smaller communities, for want of a better word, for more established forms, whether you agree with them or not, of hierarchy, right? Whether it be religious, whatever it may be. But now it's based around, as I said, popularity on likes and so on. And I think that's very different. That is very different. And they're not actually, how far they can influence that is debatable. So I think that's what's different. And that is, I would say that's generational. That, without a doubt, in my head, that's generational.
Would you say that, I'll talk about myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm driven by those things as well. You know, I want, if I put something on LinkedIn, you know, I'm happy when it gets, yeah, so I'm not sure,
Yep.
you know, isn't it more a 2021 thing than, you know, it's driven more by the world we live in?
Certainly not in the community in the people I converse with, no. I don't deem, if I look at our daughter who's 10, she will, if she's looking at Minecraft gaming, she will look at how many followers that person's got, right? And that's how she's going to go onto it. For me, that just doesn't come into my mind. I don't think at that level. That's not, that to me doesn't necessarily mean that I would necessarily see that as an authoritative voice, yeah? Because I want to really establish with the individual and connect to the individual and really understand the individual's values before I make that conscious decision. She's not doing that. She's doing it purely based on the popularity of that individual by the number of likes that individual's got or followers they've got. And that is different, yeah? That is different. Now, I'm not saying I'm not questioning whether that's right or wrong at this point. I think that's what we need to debate. But for instance, when I was young, I relied on the traditional media form for that, yeah, and other forms of hierarchy for that. It's very different now, yeah. That's where I think there is a difference in the behaviour that I'm seeing, yeah.
On this,
yeah.
on this,
does that make sense, Giles? Yeah.
On this idea is not so much generation, but the drive that you might have. I adhere my thinking to that. The idea of an exchange, but it's unbalanced or unaware, and the idea of compromise or conforming to that value. Perhaps the agreement is on how simplified that is, right?
Yeah.
You wanted to share a thought there, Mikko.
Yeah, just to build on the excellent comments from the previous speakers. I think there's many dynamics at play. When I look at my kids, they are they see tremendous value in social media, not necessarily the same social media as what we are using, and they use it probably differently from my outdated use of Facebook, for example. They are very good in hiding their identity. It seems like they're much more conscious about some of these threats than what we give them credit for. At the same time, they are probably more naive on sort of like the kind of like the manipulation of the feed that they see. You know, when you're like 15, you're not necessarily thinking about the sinister corporations, for the lack of a better word, doing things on the background. So I think it's a very dynamic thing, and I'm just kind of like thinking that is there like other generational differences, or so like even if we look like way back, I think there's a really great book that I want to mention by Helen Nissenbaum called Privacy in Context. It's a fairly old book already, but it talks about sort of like how people have always shared, and that privacy is not kind of like keeping everyone out of your life. It's about being in control of the way you share information. So it's not the sharing, it's the inappropriate sharing. It's not the use of what you shared, it's the inappropriate use. And I think there, you know, kind of like the older you get a bit more skeptical on sort of like am I the product actually, or what's happening here? When you and those are probably the kind of like some of the dynamics that are happening.
I don't know, Ben or James, want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot that we've just talked about. Coming back to the original question, I think there's a objectification happening with people, which is almost part of the technologies that we're using. So just on the base level, you know, we are using, you know, zeros and ones, and we're having to kind of squish, you know, information into a form that we can produce amazing kind of predictive technologies that we can, fill your feed with things that you maybe want to look at, and provide that service. And for me, it's always coming back to, what are those bits of information representing, and respecting that as an individual, respecting those people. And hopefully, as you were talking about the more insidious kind of use cases, we have seen companies utilize, for research, real life people, thousands of people, where they are just tweaking a small thing and getting a response. And when the price to participate, I'm talking to this generation, this younger generation, is, being on TikTok or whatever it is, and you'll get penalized by your peers if you're not doing certain things. There is a price to be a social being, and some of that is participating in certain ways. These organizations have a lot of power to make those tweaks and to, change how people, how they feel and how they behave. So I think that's like, for me, when you go into companies and you're consulting and talking about these things, it's just incredibly important to, I guess, bring that back to the respecting those people.
Yeah, I think power is the word I'd probably pick up
Right.
from that. And to your question about the generation, I probably agree with Giles in some ways that it's a 2021 thing. But, if ethics is the question of what is the good life, and I think most people fundamentally would like to decide that for themselves. They need autonomy to do that, and every generation or point in time will negotiate that with the sources of power in their lives. And in 2021, that largely is in the digital world for many of us, and particularly, I guess, this is where it might come down to younger generations, that a proportion of their lives, probably greater than older generations, will be lived in the digital space. And so there's the sources of power with which they're negotiating their autonomy, and thus their ability to live their ethical good life, are in the digital world. So that's probably potentially what's different for them.
Exactly, and this, James and Ben, this thinking of, we assume that what's on play, it's what's in the data. And you're talking about evoking in the companies and the processors and controllers of this data an awareness that these consumers hold feelings and they have an ethical balance that they pursue, etc. But that is not in the data. So narrowing down, cutting down on all those, that wealth of things that are not constrained in that simplification, right? So that brings me to my next question, and I'd like to start with you, Mikko, because I love the analogy of the mobile number as an association to an individual that is portable, right? And there is a recognition, a decision that was made to understand that that is something that belongs to a person, regardless of the company that controls it. And that decision was not data-driven. That decision was ethically or responsibly or socially, and whatever the moral concepts that participated, right? So now we shift from the new generations to the companies' views. How do we as companies that we represent, or views that we represent, bring into our organizations that which is not in the data to make decisions, like, for example, mobile numbers portability, right?
Yeah, that's a good and excellent question, because the ethics is such a elusive concept. And what's the yardstick? So the one of the problems for the company that I work in is the scale of things. So there are too many things happening all at the same time that may have an ethics dimension. So dozens of AI projects, for example, or big data analytics cases. How can we use this data for this and that purpose? So then when a traditional way for companies perhaps to look at it is to measure the risk that an activity poses on the company. But we kind of like try to move away from that a little bit through a concept of human impact assessment. To create sort of like a consistent, relatively fast, standardized measurement mechanism, methodology for people like me to quickly engage on a topic and try to understand the impacts on the human. You may question, like, why would we do that? Well, GDPR has actually driven some of it, but it's also about a value-driven company, I guess. So we basically have a framework which is based on the Human Rights Convention. So it's about rights and freedoms of individuals. I have a lawyer's background, so it was easy for me to start thinking this way. And then when you look at human rights conventions, they kind of like start from the right to life and not to be physically harmed and things. So that's where we also start. So kind of like basic question, like, what we are doing here, is it likely to lead to someone dying? Very thankfully, that's usually not the case. But then we have a long list of sort of like harms that we try to measure a particular activity against. Somewhere on the list you would find things like embarrassment or nuisance or discrimination or right of employment or whatever. And then we kind of like try to map sort of like different scenarios, and we try to get better in it. It's certainly not perfect, but it helps to start having these discussions with the business stakeholders to whom some of their objectives are sometimes slightly different from these kind of objectives. But when you bring this side of the narrative to the topic, I think most people will resonate with that. They will, because we are employees and we are human and we are parents and everything. So it's helpful dialogue.
I think that, again, to pick up on a word, human is the word really that's important. And I think with data, it's easy to look at the power and the potential, and it's often thought that data is objective and that it's going to sort of give us a clear way to chart through the messiness of everything that's human. And I think that the important thing is that we don't forget the human, and that we continue to invest in all the human mechanisms we've built to sort of negotiate between us all this messiness, and that we, whether that's democratic institutions or all the other things, that they need to sit alongside this, I guess, as kind of vehicles for that constant conversation about values and about everything that goes alongside using data responsibly.
Very good. This human and value-driven thought. Who wants to continue on that? Perhaps you. Yep.
Yeah, I think that the AI is a tool, and it very much needs to be the humans who are deciding how to use that tool. So a while back, I was working at a UK retailer that also has an insurance arm, and I'm a data scientist. And we're always looking for signals in data that can point to something else. And there is a signal in how you do your grocery shopping that it's a relatively weak signal that will suggest how likely you are to make a car insurance claim.
Wow.
Now, we found that signal, and the decision was made, and I applaud this, that when people applied for insurance, if they wanted to give their loyalty card number, then their grocery behavior would be looked at.
Yeah.
And the human decision was, if that showed that they were a lower risk than their normal demographics would have said, they were quoted a lower price. If it showed that on average they were higher risk, it would be disregarded and they would have got the price, or they got the price that would have just been dictated by their demographics. So to me, that kind of exemplifies the fact that AI can be useful. You can get you can see that, but it has to be humans over the top of it making the decision of, is that a fair use of data? And I think one overriding principle that I try and adhere to and advise anybody to is: are you using the data in a way that people would perceive as reasonable and kind of expected. And I think that most people would say it is reasonable that if I can show you that I'm a lower risk, that you use that. And I think most people would say it's not reasonable for you to be, penalising me for my grocery shopping on my insurance. So I think that to me is a great example of, ethics. I'll probably murder this quote. It's what you do when you have a choice. It's what you do above your legal responsibility. And I thought that was a great example of that, and definitely,
very good.
I'd like to see more of.
And conversely, we talk about artificial intelligence. There's also artificial stupidity, and it's important to note this. And this happens in the grocery world, where you draw correlations that actually aren't true and aren't helpful, and create unhelpful outcomes. So the classic one we always talk about was you buy cornflakes, so we're going to recommend you toilet roll, because everyone has to have toilet roll. It's always going to be in a basket. So I think the issue potentially that we also have is that if people don't have the transparency of how those decisions are being made, then they're not open to interrogation, and they are open to artificial stupidity. And if those rules and the logic and the thinking aren't able to be tested, and individuals don't have the chance to see what's going on behind the scenes, that for me, again, feels like a risky area we go into, and it takes control away from people who want to be able to query what's going on.
Because again, the sort of decision you outlined it's not whether it's the right or wrong one, but that you can say this decision was made by these people according to these factors, and then it could be interrogated by other people, and it may change over time as well. This is a really interesting thing that with AI and algorithmic systems, often we're automating decision making, and to do that you need to kind of bake values into the system, and that's something that happens at a point in time, but values change. And so how do we have processes in place so that we can continually revisit those decisions and continually update them, and sort of that process of contestation and debate? How do we ensure that there are mechanisms in place to make that happen in the algorithmic world as well?
This is all great. I mean, that's a really fantastic example, and this kind of view on, taking, a view on things which you are starting from the position of I'm a human being and I'm going to be interrogating the system in a certain way, is just a really great way of thinking about it, because you're stepping out of that commercial kind of capitalist situation. You're going, actually, we have to make money. That's a given, guys. We're not going to be here otherwise. So what's the next thing? If it doesn't make money, we can't do it. So that's a given. Let's just ignore that for now. Let's think about the human impacts and interrogate that before we actually do anything. And when we are doing things like, design it for the betterment of the situation, and you could quite easily penalize people, for a weak signal, and that seems completely unreasonable, I'm sure. And there are other examples of this, like the Compass stuff in America, and using it for like law enforcement and recidivism. So there are design decisions that we need to make, when we find this stuff in data, when we have this fabulous kind of new ability, we have to then design something which is useful.
Yeah. But to James's point about values, actually, that's also really, it's a critical ongoing discussion that I think needs to be had openly, because unless we understand the values of where people are coming from, not just from what they say, but from how they behave, whether those two things align, it is very hard to know onto what some of those decision-making processes are built. And people do have different values, and that's okay. We can't just say universally, this is good and this is bad. There is a scale by which people fall on that position. So for me, I think understanding where companies, and this is maybe where companies have an opportunity to be really clear about what their intent is, and then are open to being challenged on whether they are being true to their values. Are they accountable to the values that they state? Google famously, do no evil.
Yeah.
You know, again, debate, but at least that's a statement of intent. And then when you've got those values clear, then obviously people can make a more meaningful judgment against those stated values.